Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. I'm Alex.
I'm Eve.
Today we'll be looking at Brave New World Revisited by Aldous Huxley.
Oh, yeah.
Famous for his dystopian novel Brave New World. But this one, published in 1958, is like a sequel where he's looking back at the world and kind of reassessing his predictions and fears.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not just him, making things up.
Right.
It's him looking at real trends happening in society and saying, hey, are we actually on the path to this dystopia that I wrote about?
Like it's a reality check.
Exactly.
Not just fiction anymore.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore those warnings that he had.
Yeah.
About the things he saw happening in his time, the 50s, and how they might be relevant to us today.
It's like, having a conversation with a really insightful friend who's seen a glimpse into the future and is trying to warn you about it.
And he's worried.
Yeah.
So to start off,
okay,
Huxley tackles the issue of overpopulation right off the bat.
Right.
And he actually revisits the timeline that he had proposed in Brave New World for when his dystopia would take place. And it's kind of shocking. He actually pushed the date up, meaning he's actually become more pessimistic since writing the original book.
More pessimistic. And he actually has a reason for that shift. And the reason is overpopulation.
Oh.
He saw it as the biggest driver towards this potential totalitarianism.
Even bigger than technological advancement.
Even bigger than technological advancements. And I think what's so interesting about that is that he was writing this in the 50s, remember, after World War II.
Right.
We had just seen this massive conflict.
Right.
And, there was so much change happening in the world, technologically and socially and politically.
And he's looking at hard data, right? He's not just, pontificating from an armchair.
No, he's pointing to very specific things that are happening, like the population growth.
Right. He even highlights like the doubling time for the population, shrinking from 16 centuries to less than 50 years.
Right.
That's a crazy increase.
It is a crazy increase. It's exponential. And I think he saw that as putting immense strain on resources.
Right. It's like too many people, not enough resources.
Yeah. Leading to more competition, potential for conflict, and maybe even leading to conditions that would be favorable for authoritarianism.
Yeah, and that classic example he gives of the tropical island.
Oh, yeah.
They eliminate malaria with DDT, thinking it's going to be this amazing victory for humankind.
Right, saving lives.
But then the population explodes.
And they don't have the resources to support them.
Yeah, and it creates a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, and I think he uses this to illustrate this idea that even our best intentions can have these unintended consequences.
Right.
You try and do something good.
Like a moral dilemma.
Yeah, it's like a moral dilemma, and then it ends up backfiring, and so he really highlights that. And I think he also points out that this population growth is not just a problem of numbers.
Right.
It's also a problem of the quality of life.
So not just too many mouths to feed, but also like the quality of life for everyone is going down.
Exactly. He says, the problem of overpopulation is not, as many people think, merely a problem of numbers. It is a problem of quality as well as quantity. And he dives into this more deeply in Chapter 2, where he links overpopulation to a potential decline in human quality, both physically and intellectually.
So it's not just about having enough food and water.
It's not just about having the basic resources.
That's about the decline of the human species.
Potentially the decline, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And this is where it gets even more interesting, because he starts to bring in medical advancements.
So he's not anti-science.
He's not saying medical advancements are bad. He acknowledges the benefits, but he raises this very thought-provoking question, which is, what happens when we have medical science that allows individuals with genetic flaws to live longer and reproduce? Yeah. Could that potentially weaken the gene pool over time?
Ooh.
That's a pretty controversial question to ask even today.
Especially today.
But he was not afraid to tackle these controversial topics. And he even quotes William Sheldon, who's an American psychologist, who says that in the present state of our knowledge, we can do nothing to increase the intelligence of individuals, but we can do a great deal to increase the number of feeble-minded.
That's
yeah.
That's a bold statement.
It is a bold statement.
So essentially what he's saying is that while we're focused on saving lives, which is a noble goal,
of course,
are we not paying attention to the potential long-term consequences?
The unintended consequences.
And the species.
Right, exactly. And he goes on to say that in this overpopulated world with limited resources, you're going to have a situation where only the elite, those with higher intelligence, those who can adapt, will be able to maintain a high standard of living.
So it's almost like
Yeah.
this idea that there's going to be this massive disparity between the haves and the have-nots.
Right. And he even quotes from another book called The Next 100 Years that predicts that the masses of humanity will be reduced to a bare subsistence level.
That's pretty grim.
It is a grim prediction. And, it makes you wonder, in a world like that, what happens to democracy? Can democracy even survive?
If people are constantly just struggling for survival.
Yeah, if they're fighting over scraps, can they really participate in a meaningful way in a democratic system?
And Huxley seems to think that it can't.
He was very skeptical about that. He thought that overpopulation and scarcity would create the perfect conditions for tyranny to take root.
Because people are desperate.
People are desperate. They want security.
They'll give up their freedoms
They'll give it anything.
for a little bit of stability, for a promise of food for their families.
Right, and then whoever's in charge can just...
And those in power exploit that fear.
Exploit that fear.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
Right? And Huxley saw overpopulation as this massive crisis that could reshape society.
A crisis of epic proportions.
Yeah, and potentially threaten the very values that we hold dear.
So we've got overpopulation and we've got this potential for decline in human quality.
Right.
But there's another element that Huxley brings in to this dystopian recipe, and that's the swelling of organizations.
Swelling of organizations, yes. So in chapter 3, he kind of shifts gears a little bit and starts talking about this danger of these large, complex organizations.
They even start with good intentions, right?
Right. They might start with good intentions, but it become too big.
Too big to fail.
Too big to fail, too powerful and very difficult to control.
Right.
And he even quotes C. Wright Mills,
Okay.
who coined this term power elite to describe this phenomenon.
Break that down for us a little bit. What is the power elite?
So the power elite is not necessarily like a conspiracy or a secret cabal. It's more like a natural consequence of how our modern societies are structured.
Okay.
As organizations grow larger and more complex, they need leadership.
Centralized leadership.
Yeah, and they need people at the top to manage them effectively.
Okay.
And so this centralization of power creates this gap between the elites and the masses.
Right. So it's not just about the number of people. It's also about where the power lies.
Exactly.
And he sees this as a threat to...
A direct threat.
To individual liberty.
To individual liberties, to those Jeffersonian ideals.
The Jeffersonian ideals that we talked about.
Yeah. Limited government, individual liberty.
Yeah.
Distrust of concentrated power.
Distrust of concentrated power.
All of that he saw as being eroded by this rise of the power elite.
And he brings in a psychological element too, right?
So he does. He brings in Eric from a German psychologist and social philosopher who argued that modern society, with its emphasis on conformity and mass production, was actually detrimental to our mental health.
He thought people were being conditioned to be passive, obedient consumers rather than active, engaged citizens.
And that's what we were talking about earlier with the overpopulation.
Yeah.
It's like we're being almost like lulled to sleep.
We're being lulled into this sense of complacency.
Right. And then our freedoms...
And we don't even realize it.
...can be taken away without us even realizing it.
And Huxley picks up on this. And he says, look, humans aren't meant to be these mindless drones in some kind of organizational hive.
Right.
We need individuality.
We're not ants.
We're not ants, exactly.
Right.
And I think he saw this individuality.
Independent thought.
Independent thought as essential for human flourishing.
And he quotes William White in The Organization Man.
Yes.
He's talking about this shift in social ethics from valuing individual worth to the collective, often at the expense of the individual.
White says the old dogma of individualism is disappearing. In its place is the new dogma of social responsibility.
And Huxley saw this as a way to justify this dominance of organizations in our lives.
Yeah.
It's like we're being told that it's selfish to prioritize your own needs and desires over the needs of the organization.
Over the collective.
Over the collective, right?
And that's a slippery slope.
That is a very slippery slope, because if you're constantly sacrificing your individuality for the sake of the collective, what happens to your sense of self?
Your sense of self.
Yeah, what happens to your ability to resist those in power?
Right, and then he uses that example of the organization man.
Oh, yes.
And his wife.
The ideal.
The ideal couple.
Yeah.
And the wife is like This incredibly social and adaptable person.
Always putting her husband's career first.
Never doing anything to distract him from his work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like a perversion of traditional marriage vows.
It's like a corporate strategy.
Yeah. Like a corporate merger.
Yeah, it's like we're being colonized.
Yeah.
By these corporations.
By these organizations.
Right.
And Huxley saw this as a new form of serfdom. Very subtle, but very powerful form of social control.
We're being enslaved?
Where we become enslaved to these organizations.
Oh, we don't even realize it.
And we think it's for our own good.
Yeah, we're being told it's for the greater good.
For the greater good, for the team.
For the team.
For the company.
For a company, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's this kind of like insidious form of control that he's warning us about.
So if we're becoming so susceptible to this kind of control,
right?
How are those in power exploiting it?
Well, that's a great question, and that's where he turns his attention to the power of propaganda.
Oh,
propaganda.
Propaganda.
The dark art of persuasion.
But I thought that was more for dictatorships.
Right.
Not democracies.
That's a common misconception.
Okay.
And Huxley addresses this directly in chapter 4, which is called Propaganda in a Democratic Society. And he starts off by contrasting Thomas Jefferson's optimistic view of human rationality with his own observations about our vulnerability to manipulation.
Okay, so Jefferson
believed that if people had access to information,
right, an educated populace would make rational choices.
Right, they would be able to govern themselves effectively.
But Huxley
seems to think that we're not quite as rational as we like to think we are.
Okay.
He saw firsthand how easily people could be swayed by emotion.
By fear.
By appeals to their baser instincts.
Yeah, and he even argues that overpopulation and the rise of large organizations
make us more susceptible.
To propaganda.
He says, the increase in the size and complexity of organizations gives more power to the managers at the top. And owing to the increasing efficiency of modern techniques of persuasion, makes it easier for them to manipulate the masses.
So it's like a double whammy.
It's like a double whammy, yeah.
We've got these powerful organizations.
On one hand.
On the other hand.
On the other hand, you have these increasingly sophisticated techniques of persuasion.
Like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and he distinguishes between two types of propaganda.
Okay.
Rational and non-rational.
Give us the definitions there.
So rational propaganda appeals to reason and evidence.
Like a well-reasoned argument.
Okay. Whereas non-rational propaganda relies on emotional manipulation.
Okay.
It appeals to our fears, our desires, our prejudices.
So that's like a slick advertising campaign designed to bypass our critical thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Huxley was particularly concerned about the rise of non-rational propaganda in democratic societies.
Yeah.
Because he saw it as this threat to informed decision-making.
Right.
And a powerful tool for those who wanted to control and manipulate the masses.
And he gives some pretty chilling examples.
He does. He talks about subliminal projection.
Subliminal projection.
Embedding hidden messages in images and sounds to influence our subconscious minds.
It's like Inception.
All
right.
He even mentions hypnopedia, which is sleep teaching.
Oh, wow.
As a potential method for indoctrinating people with specific beliefs and values.
And this is the 50s?
This is the 50s.
Long before
the internet.
The internet.
Social media, all of that.
It's like he predicted it.
It's really remarkable how prescient he was, and he argues that these techniques combined with the forces we've already talked about, the overpopulation, the rise of large organizations, could create a society where people are essentially programmed to be obedient and unquestioning.
Programmed.
He writes, the greatest triumphs of propaganda have been achieved not by doing something, but by refraining from doing. Great is truth, but still greater, from a practical point of view, is silence about truth.
So it's not just about what they're telling us.
Right.
It's about what they're not telling us.
Exactly.
It's about controlling the narrative.
Suppressing
dissenting voices. Creating this culture of fear and conformity.
Exactly. And he thought that this kind of manipulation was even more insidious in a democracy.
Oh.
Because it operates under the guise of freedom and choice.
Right. We think we're making these choices freely.
But
well, we've been manipulated.
We're
making them.
He says, in a democracy, the rulers can only rule with the consent of the ruled. And they can only obtain this consent by persuading the ruled that they are free.
It's like an invisible cage.
It's like an invisible cage, yeah.
We're free to make these choices.
You're free to choose whatever you want.
But the choices have already been made for us.
But the choices have already been narrowed down.
And we don't even realize it.
And that's the essence of Huxley's warning.
So it's not just about political propaganda.
Not just about political propaganda, no. He also saw these techniques being used in commercial advertising.
Right. And he has a whole chapter.
The whole chapter.
On the arts of selling.
On the arts of selling, yes.
And he draws this really interesting parallel between the methods used by dictators.
Like Hitler.
Yeah. And the methods used by advertisers.
Advertisers on Madison Avenue.
Like the same playbook.
Yeah. He uses the metaphor of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to illustrate this point.
Right.
So Dr. Jekyll represents the rational side of advertising, providing accurate information.
Appealing to our reason.
Yeah. But then you have Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
The darker side.
The dark side.
The master manipulator.
The manipulator.
Who uses our irrationality.
Our fears.
Our insecurity.
To sell us things that we don't need.
That we don't need or even want.
Right.
And he argues that in a democratic society, advertisers can't just use these blatant propaganda tactics like, fear-mongering or hate speech.
Yeah, they have to be more subtle.
They have to be much more subtle.
More seductive.
Yeah.
So instead of appealing to
our fears directly,
our base instincts,
they appeal to our desires.
Our desires.
Our desires for status.
For belonging. Security.
Even love.
Love.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
It's brilliant from a marketing perspective because they're bypassing our rational minds and appealing directly to our emotional core.
It's not about the product.
It's not about the product. It's about
the lifestyle.
It's about the emotion.
The feeling.
That's associated with it.
And he gives the example of cosmetics advertising.
Oh, yeah.
They're not selling lipstick.
They're selling
They're selling
the confidence.
Attractiveness. They're tapping into those deep-seated desires that we all have.
To be loved.
To be loved. To be accepted, to be desired. And it's not just cosmetics.
Right.
He talks about cars, alcohol book.
He talks about everything. And he says, advertisers are using symbolic language and imagery to create this kind of compensatory dream world.
A fantasy.
A fantasy that distracts us
from reality.
From the reality of our lives.
And we're buying into it. Hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
But what's so dangerous about that?
Well, he would argue that it's not harmless.
Oh, wow.
Because when we become so accustomed to this kind of emotional manipulation, it becomes harder to distinguish between truth and fiction. Between genuine needs and manufactured desires.
Right.
And we become more susceptible to propaganda, both political and commercial.
So it's like we're being conditioned. Slowly but surely. To be more passive. More compliant. More willing to accept the status quo.
Yeah.
And Huxley even takes it a step further.
He talks about how advertisers exploit our inherent human tendency towards ritual and spectacle. Yeah, and he draws this parallel between religious ceremonies and political rallies. Like those massive Nazi rallies we see in the old footage.
With the flags.
The torches, the chanting crowds.
Yeah.
He argues that these spectacles are incredibly powerful because they bypass our critical thinking.
Yeah.
And they tap into our primal instincts.
It's about belonging. Shared purpose. Transcendence.
Yeah. And it's easy to get swept up in that.
Yeah.
And he warns us about the danger of associating beauty with truth.
Right.
Just because something looks and feels good doesn't mean it's actually true or ethical.
Like those Nazi rallies again.
They were aesthetically impressive.
Yeah.
Well choreographed.
They were well done.
They were well done, but the message
was horrific.
So we have to be careful not to be seduced by the surface, by the spectacle. We have to look deeper, question the message.
Everybody critically.
Think critically, absolutely.
Right.
And Huxley reminds us that this is a constant battle and an ongoing struggle against these forces that are trying to manipulate us.
Right.
He says the propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human.
Wow.
Mm.
That's chilling.
That's a chilling thought.
It is a chilling thought, but it's also a powerful call to awareness.
So we need to be vigilant.
We need to be vigilant.
Informed. Critical thinkers.
And critical thinkers.
To resist this manipulation.
To resist this manipulation, yes.
But is there anything more we can do?
That's a great question, and that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so stay tuned.
Yeah.
And we'll be right back after a short break.
Yeah, so, we've been talking about these really dark forces in society.
Yeah, it's getting pretty bleak here. It is. But, Huxley doesn't leave us completely without hope.
Okay.
In these remaining chapters. He does explore some potential solutions.
Solutions to this, dystopia.
To these trends, to these forces that are trying to control us.
So is it like a revolution, or is it?
No, it's not about overthrowing the system.
Okay.
It's much more about individual responsibility.
Okay.
About cultivating a certain mindset.
Okay.
A way of being in the world that is more resistant to manipulation.
So it's more like inner transformation.
The transformation.
Than outer revolution.
Exactly. And he really emphasizes the importance of critical thinking.
Critical thinking?
He says, we need to teach people how to question assumptions.
Yeah.
How to analyze information.
How to recognize.
How to recognize logical fallacies.
Right.
It's about being aware of the techniques that are being used to influence us.
So it's like seeing through the illusions.
Seeing through the illusions.
The propaganda, the emotional appeals.
Right.
And getting to the heart.
Getting to the heart of the matter.
Of the matter, yeah.
And he also emphasizes the importance of understanding history.
History.
Especially the history of tyranny and oppression.
Okay.
He has this famous quote.
Yeah.
Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
And he thought that by studying the mistakes of the past, we could learn to recognize those warning signs in the present.
The patterns.
The patterns, yeah.
Okay, so we can avoid
making those same mistakes.
Making the same mistakes.
It's interesting.
And he also makes this kind of surprising argument for the importance of decentralization. And community.
Okay.
He thought that strong local communities could act as a buffer against the power of large organizations and the state.
So it's like empowering people at the local level.
At the local level, yeah, giving them more control over their lives and their communities.
So it's like that sense of connection. Sense
of belonging that we've lost.
That we've lost in this mass society.
To counter the alienation.
Exactly. Yeah. And he saw this as a way to resist the trend toward conformity and homogenization that he thought was inherent in mass societies.
Okay.
He writes, the more centralized and standardized a society becomes, the greater the danger of its being subjected to totalitarian control.
So his solutions are kind of like this multi-pronged approach.
It's a multi-pronged approach, yeah.
Critical thinking.
Education.
Understanding history.
Decentralization.
Community, yeah.
It's a tall order.
It is a tall order.
But
it's not impossible.
It's not impossible. And I think it's important to remember that he wrote this book as a warning.
Yeah.
Not as a prediction.
A warning.
He believed that if we were aware of the dangers, we could still choose a different path.
We have agency.
We have agency. Yeah. We have a choice. He writes, the future is not something that happens to us. It is something that we create.
Powerful.
It is a powerful message.
It's not predetermined.
Yeah.
We can still shape it.
Both
individually.
And collectively.
Yeah. But we have to be intentional. We have to be engaged. We have to be willing to resist.
Those forces.
Those forces that are trying to control us.
And his final question
in
the book really sums up
Yeah.
this challenge that we face.
It does. He asks, can we, in a world increasingly dominated by mass societies and persuasive technologies, resist the forces that seek to homogenize and control us, and instead choose to embrace our unique individuality and pursue a life of meaning and freedom? Wow. It's a question.
It is a question.
It's been quite a journey through Aldous Huxley's Brave New World Revisited.
It has, hasn't it? Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground from overpopulation and the rise of these massive organizations to propaganda, both the overt and the subtle and sneaky kind.
Yeah, and really this picture that he paints is one of a world where individual freedom is constantly under threat.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak when you think about it. He's really saying that, all these forces are converging technology, population growth, consumerism,
Right.
and creating a world that really does resemble that dystopia he imagined back in Brave New World, several decades earlier.
Yeah, but he doesn't leave us completely without hope.
No, he does offer some glimmers of hope,
Yeah.
some ways forward, some paths we could take.
Yeah, and one of the key things he focuses on is education.
Yes, education.
And really kind of this idea that it can be this antidote to all these forces that are eroding freedom.
Mm.
But, we talked about how it can also be used for bad, like brainwashing.
Absolutely. It's a double-edged sword.
So how do we make sure that it's being used for good?
Well, he says, it's about critical thinking, it's about independent judgment,
Yeah.
it's about valuing individual differences. He says education should be a process of opening doors, not of closing them.
So it's not about like indoctrinating students with a particular set of beliefs.
No.
It's about how to think critically.
Exactly. How to analyze, information, how to question things,
Question things, yeah.
not just take things at face value.
And he even suggests that we should focus more on teaching people how to learn
Yeah,
as opposed to just memorizing facts, which makes sense in a world that's changing so quickly, right?
absolutely. I mean, the ability to adapt and learn new things and think critically is essential these days, more than ever.
It's almost like giving people this toolkit
Huh.
to navigate this world of information overload and these different ideologies.
Yeah, and all these new technologies that are coming out all the time.
Yeah, I mean, and really for him, he emphasizes teaching history.
Yes.
And understanding the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Understanding, the dangers of unchecked power.
Right.
Of blind obedience.
Right.
And sacrificing freedom for security. These are all things we need to learn from.
It was also about nurturing, I guess, the things that make us human.
Right.
Creativity,
Yes.
empathy, a sense of wonder.
And Huxley even suggests that the arts can play a really big role in this,
Interesting.
He says the arts can make us aware of the beauty and the mystery of the world and can help us to see things in new ways.
So it's almost like engaging with art becomes this act of resistance.
Yes.
A way to reclaim our humanity in a world that feels increasingly, cold and impersonal.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great way to put it.
And I think that really gets at the heart of Huxley's message here, right?
Yeah.
He's not just warning us. He's really inviting us
Yeah.
to create a better world.
Right, to take action.
And so Brave New World Revisited, while it's definitely a challenging book,
It is.
it's also, I think, a hopeful one.
I think so too. He doesn't believe that this is a foregone conclusion. He thinks that we have a choice.
Right.
That we can passively accept these trends or we can resist them.
Yeah. And that resistance really begins with each of us.
Absolutely. It's individual.
Our choices, our actions, our commitment to creating something better.
And if you're feeling overwhelmed by all of this, just remember what he said. It is only by taking an active part in the world around us that we can hope to make it a better place.
So to all of our listeners out there, I definitely encourage you to read Brave New World Revisited.
Yes.
And really engage with these ideas.
And think critically about the world that we're creating.
Yeah, because ultimately it's in our hands.
It is.
So that's it for this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope you enjoyed exploring these complex and thought-provoking issues with us.
This is Alex and Eve.
Until next time, keep those notes of curiosity flowing.